All right, everyone, welcome to our webinar today on first aid. Thank you for joining us. We have quite a full room right now, so please, we're just going to get started right away so that we have our full time. So before we get started, though, I'd like to acknowledge that I'm grateful to be joining you from my home office in Kelowna, which is located on the traditional unceded territories of the Silk Okanagan people, including the Westband First Nations and the Okanagan Indian Band, where I have the honor to live, work, and play. We also would like to acknowledge that the Go2HR office is being located in Vancouver, is on the unceded traditional territories of the Coast Salish peoples, including the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh nations, where some of us are honored to live, work, and play as well. And Go2HR would also like to acknowledge that the work that we do is across the whole province, and it takes place on the traditional unceded territories of 203 distinct nations. So we pay respect to these nations and are grateful to live, work, travel, and play on these lands and waters of the BC's Indigenous peoples. So we will introduce our special guest here in a moment, but first Simi and I would like to introduce ourselves as well. So my name is Lonnie Burnett. I'm an industry health and safety specialist with Go2HR. I've been working at Go2HR in this position for just over 3 years. Really love it, obviously. And previously to that, I've worked in a variety of operations within our industry, so including ski resorts, outdoor tourism, adventure, and restaurants, and a bunch of other ones. So Simi, who is going to be our moderator for our Q&A session, would you like to say hello and introduce yourself as well?
Yeah, thank you, Lonnie. So hello, everyone. I'm Simi. I'm the other industry health and safety specialist. I started my safety journey at BCIT, where I graduated with a diploma in occupational health and safety. And from there, I worked as a health and safety coordinator in the agricultural industry, and then worked my way into tourism and hospitality, working with Go2HR. So I've been here for about 4 months now. So fairly new, but I'm happy to be here and taking part in some awesome initiatives that are offered by the organization. So yeah, thank you.
Awesome. Thanks, Simi. And for most of you are probably aware and familiar with Go2HR, so I'm not going to delve too far into it. But the bottom line for us is to support the tourism and hospitality industry in health and safety, HR, training, and research and strategy in order to drive strong workforces and safer workplaces that deliver world-class tourism and hospitality experiences in BC. So if you're not already familiar with Go2HR, just encourage you to check out go2hr.ca, where you'll find a variety of resources and support available to make your lives a lot easier. So today's presentation, we have a few different things we're going to cover. First, Tim's going to give us an overview of those regulatory changes that hopefully we're at least somewhat familiar with already. I'm going to run through an assessment example for us. We're going to talk about the available resources and support that Go2HR has for you, and then we'll run into our Q&A period. So without further ado, I'd like to hand it over to Tim. But before I do that, I'll just give a little bit of an intro to him. So for the past 20 years, Tim has supported workers and employers in the areas of disability management and injury prevention. In his current job as the industry and program specialist at WorkSafeBC, Tim supports the tourism and hospitality sector by providing education, consultation, and partnership with the industry stakeholders on health and safety initiatives. So happy to introduce to you Tim Pride. And Tim, yeah, whenever you're ready, you can take over the slides and give us all of the good information you got for us today.
Great. Great. Okay. Thanks very much, Lonnie, for that excellent introduction. And I'm going to share my slide deck here. I'll just ask if everyone can see that.
Yes, we can see
Lonnie, if
it.
you can let me know. Great.
Yep.
Okay. So, yeah, as Lonnie mentioned, I'm going to give an overview of the changes. I'm going to cover the key points and then hand it back to Lonnie to kindly go through a first aid assessment. So for my piece, I'm going to cover 6 main aspects. I'm going to go over some of the key rationale behind the first aid changes. I'm going to talk about workplace class factors. I'm going to introduce the first aid assessment, talk about drills, go over some of the CSA alignment that's happening, and finish off with OHS guidelines. So the first aid regulation has remained largely unchanged for about 20 years. And so over this time period, of course, there's been improvements to both first aid training and equipment and methods for treatment. So that is one of the reasons that led to the changes. So in April of 2023, WorkSafeBC's board of directors, they approved the amendments to Part 3 of the regulation. And so some of the things that will happen is that you'll see that we've strengthened the requirements for the minimum levels of first aid, as noted in Schedule 3A, particularly for high risk and remote workplaces. There's also been enhancements to transportation and equipment requirements for these remote and less accessible work locations. And we've done our best to align with the Canadian Standards Association. And this is something that the provinces across Canada have been working on for the last several years. One of the reasons that they've done this is to improve the transferability of labor. So, to help workers going, say, from Alberta to BC and fulfill their duties as a first aid attendant, for example. So within the regulation itself, we have some key amendments. As mentioned, we've introduced the concept of workplace class, which is really just a way of defining location and accessibility factors around a workplace. We have a new definition on what a remote workplace is. And so that is now a workplace that is 30 minutes from an ambulance station. Previously, we measured the time from a workplace to a hospital, and a remote workplace was greater than 20 minutes. So we've changed the remote definition. In terms of the less accessible framework, we're going to talk about this a little bit later, but this helps in determining the type of class workplace that you are. Another key amendment to the regulation is the requirement to do a written first aid assessment. Now, with the pre-existing regulation, first aid assessments were actually required, but it wasn't stated that they needed to be written. So this is now embedded in the regulation. Other things that have changed are the fact that the first aid assessment needs to be done in consultation with workers. So if you're a large enough workplace, that would be your joint health and safety committee. If you're a smaller workplace, this could be a work representative. Other requirements include annual drills, and then of course the alignment with first aid certification and kits in terms of the Canadian standards. So just talking briefly about remote workplaces, you can see a map here with all of the ambulance stations with BC Emergency Health Services. And so when we talk about the 30-minute threshold, this is what we would say would be the normal travel conditions between the workplace and the station. Moving on to less accessible workplaces, there are many factors that could make a workplace less accessible, but essentially these are workplaces that an ambulance cannot reach traveling by land. Have work areas where BC ambulance attendants cannot safely access. Some examples of less accessible workplaces would be backcountry areas that are only accessible by ATVs, snowmobiles, or similar equipment. Areas where the only means of access involves slippery slopes or embankments without walkways. Areas or rough or complex terrain, such as, say, a forestry work site or a construction site. Areas where there is a significant risk of avalanche, landslide, flood, or other natural hazards. And so if you have workers that are in these areas on your workplace, you can consider your workplace to be less accessible for the purpose of doing the assessment. We have some other examples of less accessible places on a work site. We also call these hazardous areas, and these are things such as confined spaces. You might find confined spaces in a number of workplaces, whether that is maybe vats or tanks at a brewery, or other small regions. Other things that we want to identify as hazardous workplaces are underground work, excavations, work at heights that are only accessible by ladder, scaffold, or temporary work platforms, work on or over water in areas where specialized personal protective equipment is required, such as, say, asbestos abatement workplaces, for example. And so going back to workplace class, really it's just a different combination of accessibility and location factors. So your class 1 workplace is really your urban work location that doesn't have barriers to access, for example, restaurants or hotels in an urban setting. A class 2 workplace is a workplace that is remote but not less accessible. So this might be a hotel or a lodge in a rural area that is greater than 30 minutes from an ambulance station. A class 3 workplace could be a workplace that is less accessible but not remote, say a ski resort, which is close to town or in an urban area. And a class 4 workplace would be both remote and less accessible. This would be common in forestry operations. It could also be an outdoor tourism operator or a ski hill in a remote area of BC. Okay, so now that we've talked about workplace class factors, let's go over the first aid assessment in general detail. To start, I'd like to review some language from the OHS regulation. And so section 316 of the new regulation states that an employer must provide for each workplace at least the equipment, supplies, facilities, first aid attendance, and services required by Schedule 3A. And any additional equipment, supplies, facilities, first aid attendance, and services that are necessary to ensure that workers who suffer an injury at work can be promptly provided first aid and promptly transported to medical attention. So this regulation sets the stage for a two-part duty that an employer will have when conducting a first aid assessment. It requires the employer to determine the minimum levels of first aid based on the employer's hazard rating, location, and nature of the workplace, in addition to the number of workers at that workplace. It also obliges the employer to consider any unique workplace-specific attributes or hazards that may impact the provision of first aid services. Minimum first aid services are determined by assessing 3 factors: the hazard rating, the workplace class, and the number of workers present at the workplace. When we talk about hazard ratings, these are assigned by WorkSafeBC to each industry based on claims statistics and knowledge of common risks and hazards that are typically associated to those types of workplaces. And you can find your hazard ratings on our website, WorkSafeBC.com. So to emphasize once again, this important requirement, in addition to determining the minimum requirements for first aid, employers must consider the unique circumstances of the workplace to verify the minimum requirements and to ensure that you consider the additional factors. So later on, Lonnie will be looking at Schedule 3A as part of the assessment process. This is just the starting point. The second part is to consider all of these additional factors. Okay, so some important notes about the first aid assessment. It is required to be reviewed and updated as necessary on an annual basis, or if there are any significant changes that affect the assessment. And so things that would be considered significant changes could be changes to the number of workers present at the workplace. If there's a change to the workplace class due to accessibility or remoteness. If there's any additional hazards that are introduced to the work operations. And if there's any barriers that you identify in terms of transporting injured workers to workplaces. So when doing the first aid assessment, it should be documented and it should be kept on file so that if an officer does visit the work site, they are available to show to the officer. And so another important change that came along with the regulation is there's a greater involvement of workers in this process. So it is required that they participate in both the assessment process and the review. And so depending on the size of the workplace, as stated earlier, this might be with a joint committee or a worker health and safety rep. And so, it's important to note here that workers who are performing the work are in the best position to inform employers of hazards and risks that are associated with the tasks. And so that's why we really feel strongly about having workers included in this process. Okay, so we do have a tool that's designed to assist employers in this first aid assessment. It can be downloaded off our website. It's a fillable PDF form. It's available now and it walks you through the process. And we will also have a digital tool available on the website in the next month or so. So when filling out these forms, they don't need to be submitted to WorkSafe. So just keep them on record for when you have a visit from an officer. Okay, so let's move on now to first aid. So much of the information in this regulation is very similar to the pre-existing regulation. I've bolded any of the new information on these slides. And so just to go over the regulation here, written procedures should include the names of first aid attendants and their first aid certification level where practicable, as well as a description of first aid equipment and supplies that are available at the worksite. Procedures should instruct workers on how to obtain first aid for both minor and serious injuries, and they should include instructions on the expected response of first aid attendants when it may be necessary to either transport the injured worker or request emergency services. The location of first aid equipment and supplies must be included in procedures. And one consideration is to include a map to provide a visual reference for workers. It's important to note here that in many workplaces, first aid attendants perform other tasks in addition to their duties as first aid attendants. So procedures may be required to enable the first aid attendant to leave their workstation safely and to provide the necessary first aid assistance. Okay, section 317 here continues by stating that written procedures for first aid must include a statement about the authority of the first aid attendant. And so for more information regarding the authority of first aid attendants, I encourage you to review the guidelines, which I'm going to be showing the document later in this presentation. So another change with the regulation, as shown in bold here, is that if emergency transportation is required, as noted in Schedule 3A, when you do your assessment, the procedures must note the location and the method of emergency transportation. And as always required, the emergency procedures must state the prearranged routes in and out of the workplace to medical treatment, if that's necessary. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about remote workplaces now. So in the case of remote workplaces where BC ambulance services may be significantly delayed or where the nearest medical facility is more than 2 hours away from the workplace, employers should consider providing alternative means or supplementary methods to transport seriously injured workers. And so in some situations, this might involve having an emergency transport vehicle. In other workplaces, especially in very remote settings, such as a forestry workplace, this might involve having specific emergency transportation, air transportation, sorry. So for more specific details on emergency transport vehicles, I'm going to encourage you to look at the OHS guidelines because they give good detail on emergency transport vehicles as well as air transportation. Okay, so before I wrap up this piece on first aid procedures, I wanted to talk about communication. It's important for all workers to understand the first aid procedures and be able to easily access these procedures for reference in the event of an injury. Where practical, first aid procedures should be printed and posted throughout the workplace, including places like lunchrooms or other areas where workers congregate. Procedures can also be made available through the company intranet or through a shared drive or network. Other methods or procedures that might include things like using QR codes, mobile apps, and having printed copies available in vehicles. And of course, copies of first aid procedures should be added to first aid kits. Okay, so now we're going to move on to talking about drills. As I mentioned earlier, drills are required annually and whenever procedures change in the workplace. Some examples for changes in the workplace that would require you to repeat your drills would be things like if the workplace class has changed, if you've changed your methods for transporting workers to medical treatment, if there's been changes in the way that you summon first aid. So does that take place over through communication tools, through the use of flashing lights or other methods? And if there's any changes to your rescue procedures from less accessible or hazardous work areas, this should involve performance of a new drill. So when we talk about drills, there's 6 main criteria that we want to evaluate to assess the effectiveness of your first aid procedures. So these would be things like workers' familiarity with how to call for first aid and the location of the first aid equipment, how effectively the first aid attendant can be summoned and respond to both minor and serious injuries, how effectively an injured worker can be accessed and moved, and if there are any barriers present in the workplace. We also want to consider how effectively an injured worker can be prepared for transport by BC Ambulance. And we want to know if first aid attendants are familiar with the documentation and reporting requirements. Now, very important to note that drills should not pose an undue hazard to workers, the public, or their first aid or your first aid attendants. You're going to be conducting mock scenarios, and these scenarios are designed to support the evaluation of your procedures. They're not designed to assess a first aid attendant's ability to treat an injury. It's more with respect to the procedures. And when doing your drills, please don't contact 911. That would create unnecessary stress for all parties involved. But what you can do is you can explain to the workers and first aid attendants involved what the process of contacting 911 would look like. Okay, so as mentioned, drills need to be performed annually and when there's significant changes in procedures. Okay, so now let's talk about some of the changes with first aid training and equipment to fall in line with the CSA standards. All first aid certificate titles have changed. They are going from OFA 1, 2, and 3 to basic, intermediate, and advanced first aid. Intermediate first aid is now a 2-day course. The other courses remain the same length, and we still require a transportation endorsement, which is a 1-day course in certain cases. Now, important to note here that if you have a valid, or if your workers have valid first aid certificates, they will remain valid until their natural expiry date. So if you have an attendant who updated their certificate in April of 2024, that will remain valid until April 2027. Something specific to OFA 2 certificates, because of the changes to the intermediate course duration and to reduce the stress of getting these changes made before November 1st, we have extended all OFA 2 certificates that expire after July 2nd until October the 30th. We have a document which lists all of the approved training providers. You can access this on our website if you simply do a search for workplace first aid training providers. Now, not all of those training providers will be ready to deliver the new CSA courses. So please check with them first to see that they've had their courses approved and that they're ready to deliver the training. But a number of providers have started delivering their training since September the 1st. Okay, one other important thing to note here about first aid credentials. This pertains to paramedics and nurses. So under the pre-existing regulation, nurses and paramedics were required to complete some additional training before obtaining a first aid certificate for occupational situations. Going forward with the new regulation, paramedics with licenses will automatically receive a first aid certificate. And so you can see that there's differing levels. A paramedic with a first responder license will be deemed to have an intermediate first aid equivalency. Registered nurses will also be determined to have an intermediate level of equivalency, as well as registered psychiatric nurses. In terms of nurses, this is only for when they are acting as first aid attendants within the health authority. And so in addition, for any first aid attendants that are coming from outside of province, there is a process for them to have their basic, intermediate, and advanced tickets recognized in BC. It requires going to or contacting a local first aid provider in BC. There is some paperwork to complete, but there is a process to have their tickets recognized in BC. Okay, so as well, along with the training, there's also some changes to the first aid kit requirements to align with the CSA standard. We do have a document which does list all of the contents of the first aid kits, and you can find that online. In the chart on the left-hand side, you can see that the personal kit is now was going to remain being called the personal kit. The level 1 kit will now be called the basic kit. The level 2 kit will be the intermediate kit, and the level 3 kit is an intermediate kit with oxygen therapy, with an addition of an oxygen therapy kit. When you see the reference to PPE in the table there, that refers to the inclusion of 6 medical face masks and 2 face shields. And so this is something that was added to first aid kits after the COVID-19 pandemic, and it will remain a part of first aid kits. You also see in the chart there in bold the word medium. So the CSA kits can be ordered in a small, medium, or large format. They have the same components, but there will be a differing amount of each component. And so it is the medium size kit that will fulfill the requirements. And so it's important to note that you do not need to go out and replace all of your first aid kits. Please simply augment the kits as necessary to have a full kit under the CSA standard. This chart here gives you an example of the equipment that needs to be added to your kit. So if you are looking to upgrade your basic first aid kit, for example, in the second row, you can see that you'll need to add 6 adhesive bandages, 1 compress pressure dressing with ties, and 4 hand cleaning. And so please go through your kits, see what you need to add to it, and then augment that as you can. Okay, so lastly, I want to finish up talking about the OHS. So this is a large document which is available on our website. It's currently referred to as the preliminary revision because they don't come into effect until November 1st. It's quite a detailed document which goes into all of the things I've talked about here today, as well as some additional topics. You can see some of the new sections listed in the chart there on the right-hand side. So please take some time to review this document. And so just to finish up here, I'm just going to review some key considerations. Please remember first aid certificates remain valid until their expiration. So retraining is not required unless your certificate is expired. First aid kits don't need to be replaced. They just need to be added to. Written first aid assessments are required annually. We have tools available to help with those first aid assessments, including a digital tool, which will be coming out soon. We talked about the performance of drills. Remember, these need to be done annually and whenever first aid procedures change significantly. And as mentioned, we have significant detail on the new regulation and guidance for employers in the OHS guideline, which is posted to our website. And so, Lonnie, I'm going to pass it back to you now.
Thank you, Tim. I'm thinking you can see my screen now, correct? Yeah, perfect. Awesome. Okay, great. So we are going to continue on after that great overview of the new changes into conducting an assessment. So we'll get into some more of the specifics of that first aid assessment and hopefully lead you guys in order to do one on your own locations. So we are going to conduct an assessment for an example business called Lonnie's Hotel. So it's a hotel with a restaurant and a pool. We have 48 workers on site during the day, and overnight we have 8 workers. It's located here in Kelowna. I've picked just a random street crossing just in order for us to determine location from that ambulance station. We're in our classification unit of short-term overnight accommodation, and our hazards are typical of our classification unit. So that's what we're going to work with as a bit of a profile. And what we're going to do is walk through the assessment. So I'm going to pull up an example. So when you download the assessment off the WorkSafe website, this is what you're going to get, a fillable PDF. You can put all of your information in. So I've put my employer name in there. I've put our location. There's a section here that says shift name and or time. So there's opportunity to do multiple first aid assessments for like one hotel or one location, depending on what shift. So you can see during in our hotel, we have 48 workers during the day, 8 workers overnight. So there's going to be a bit of a difference between the two shifts when it comes to determining that minimum level of first aid. So depending on your own organization, that might be something that you need to consider to do more than one first aid assessment, depending on the location and depending on what kind of work hazards and whatnot that you have going on at those locations. You got your date that you've done it. The workers consulted, like Tim said, the workers must be consulted. So whether that's members of your joint health and safety committee, if you have over 20 employees, remember that that is a requirement to have a safety committee. If you're under that, you either have just regular workers that you use to consult, or you have that worker health and safety representative. So if you have between 10 and 19 staff, you're required to have one worker health and safety rep. So yeah, that's where you kind of list who you've talked to about this from the worker side. And then again, just your name, whoever filled out this assessment worksheet. So now we get to determine the minimum levels of first aid. So we want to put in here the maximum number of workers that is going to be at that location or on that shift at one time. So like I said, we have 48 workers on site during the day shift. So I'm going to put 48 in there. And then we're going to continue on. It asks us if this is a separate administrative location. I'm going to put no, because that's just our one site that we have. And it asks us what our classification unit is. So I've put it in there. And we get to determine, we have to figure out what our hazard rating that WorkSafe has assigned to our classification unit is. If you click on this hyperlink or scan this QR code, it's going to take you to this workplace hazard ratings PDF. So then we can scroll down and we can find, okay, tourism and hospitality. We can click on that. It'll take us to our tourism and hospitality section. And then we go down the line and we try and find our 1056 classification unit, overnight and short-term accommodation. So the hazard rating that WorkSafe has given us is that low hazard rating. So that's great. We can go back to our first aid assessment. We're going to put low in there. Now we're going to ask the question of whether work activities at this location are typical of our classification unit. So we can have a bit of a thought process or a brainstorming session of like, yes, these are typical of our classification unit. No, some of the work activities are outside of our classification unit. And so in our case, yes, our activities are pretty typical of our classification unit. Lots of hotels have restaurants, lots of hotels have pools. So then we're going to keep that hazard rating of low. We don't have to incorporate any other activities that are more consistent with a classification unit that has a higher hazard rating. So we're going to press low and we can continue on. Now, this is where we get to just figure out if our workplace is remote and less accessible. So WorkSafe has provided, or maybe BC Ambulance has provided, this great map where you can kind of figure out where the ambulance station is that is closest to your location. So I've put in the search bar Kelowna, and the one that's closest to us is this Kelowna Lawrence station. So we're gonna zoom in here and find our Lawrence station. And so that's the one that's closest to us. So then we can go to Google Maps and punch that in, station 340, and our location of our hotel, so which is on Ellis Street in Cambridge, which is just a random location that I chose. So there's a park there, there's nothing else there. But just for our example in particular, our drive time is 6 minutes, you can see. So from the ambulance station around to our location. So when we go back to our assessment worksheet, we can write in here 6 minutes during regular travel time from the station 340 to our location. And the reason why I put this in here as station 340 is because it's kind of like in, I don't know, 8th grade or something, when your math teacher was like, show your work, right? You want to be able to show what station you were talking about, how many minutes it was when you Googled it, that kind of stuff. Another reason why we want to do that is because we might have two ambulance stations that are pretty close. So we can list the first one that's the closest, and then the second one that's closest. Sometimes there will be accessibility issues from one, so then it's good to list the second one, because maybe an ambulance would be coming from that station rather than the closest station, depending on accessibility or number of ambulances that are available and whatnot. So if you have more than one that's like really close, then yeah, by all means you can list that. So because we're 6 minutes away from the ambulance station, we can determine that we are not remote. So that's perfect. Now we get to ask about less accessibility. So we'll go through group 1 areas first. So do we have, and while we're doing this in our example, keep in mind that we're a hotel in basically downtown Kelowna. So we don't have any backcountry areas that are only accessible by ATV. We don't have any areas that are steep or slippery embankments without walkways to them. We don't have any private roads that need to be open in order to make it accessible to BC Ambulance. We don't have any rough or complex terrain areas, and there's no significant risk of avalanche or landslide or flood or anything like that. And we don't use a ferry. So we don't have to check any of those, which is great. Now we go and talk about those hazardous areas that Tim mentioned earlier. So the confined space, the underground work areas, excavation, areas that are only accessible by ladders, high angles. So if people do regular work up on the roofs that don't have a guardrail on them, those types of things are going to be plugged in during this accessibility section of your assessment. So we don't have any confined space at Lonnie's Hotel. We don't have any underground work areas or excavations. There's areas that are accessible by ladder that we store stuff, but it's not necessarily a work area, so that's okay. We don't have any unguarded fall hazards or anything like that. We have a pool, but we're not doing work on or over water. So we're not working on docks, we're not working on boats, so then that's fine. The areas required by to have personal protective equipment where hazardous atmospheres exist, we don't have any asbestos or anything like that on site, so that's good. And we don't have any other hazardous areas that are not accessible to BC Ambulance. So that's great. We don't have to check any of those. Say we did have to check one. Say we did have a dock outside our hotel onto the lake. Then potentially we would have to check this one where we have an unguarded, or sorry, we would check this one where we have that on work on or over water. If we do have that, then we go down to this section and we can answer some of these questions. If we have the provision to rescue workers from that area so that they are then accessible by BC Ambulance, that's great. We're not remote and we don't have any group 1 boxes selected. So if we are able to rescue those people from that hazardous area and make them accessible to BC Ambulance, then we can continue to be not less accessible. If we can't rescue them ourselves, then we would have to be less accessible. So if you have concerns about that, or maybe you think you should check some of these boxes, but you aren't sure, just let us know, like get in touch with us and we'll do an assessment with you specifically to answer those questions. But for Lonnie's Hotel, we're going to go with no answers there, which is great. Then we can be not less accessible for our hotel. With that information, then we get to decide what class of workplace we are. So we determine that we are not remote and we are not less accessible. Therefore, we are a class 1 workplace. So if I click this hyperlink or scan this QR code, it's going to take me to this chart, which is the Schedule 3A replacement. Okay, so I assume if you've done a first aid assessment with the old regulation, you would have seen the Schedule 3A charts. So this is the replacement to that. So class 1 workplace, that's what we are. We've determined that. We have a low hazard rating, which is great. And then we have 48 workers during our day shift. So this is the quadrant that we want to look at. So we need a basic first aid kit and a basic first aid attendant at our hotel during the day shift. So we can go back to our worksheet and scroll down a little bit, and then we can say, okay, according to that, we need a basic first aid kit and one basic first aid attendant. When you start getting into some of the more complex workplaces, they might have you have one intermediate ticket and one basic attendant, or two, or like more than that. So just that's why it lists one or two or three in those different areas. So for Lonnie's Hotel, we need a basic first aid kit and a basic first aid attendant. We don't need any first aid facilities, and we don't need any emergency transportation for workers. Okay, so that gives us our minimum first aid requirement. And that used to be where the first aid assessment was completed before the new regulation. But now we get to talk about that second step, that extra step that Tim was talking about, to talk about those additional first aid measures that we might want to take into consideration based on the risk and hazards unique to our workplace, not typical of our CU, the types of injuries that we've previously seen at our workplace, those barriers that could limit first aid being accessible to workers, the equipment that might be necessary to rescue some of those workers from those less accessible areas, and then those known barriers that may affect BC's ambulance response time or travel time to the hospital. So I've pre-filled this out with some of what I thought of during my assessment for Lonnie's Hotel. So the risk and hazards beyond our classification unit. So I was like, okay, restaurants, that's something that's beyond, slightly beyond just a hotel, right? And so we have lacerations and burns sometimes happens in the kitchen, right? So I put that in. For our pool, there's a lot of extra chemicals that we have that if we didn't have a pool, we wouldn't have on site. Slips, trips, and falls also on the pool deck, potentially, that kind of thing. Seasonal hazards, so heat stress, snow clearing, so either whether that's slip and trip on ice outside, or if it's shoveling snow and somebody gets a sore back from that. So what I'm trying to show here is the additional things, the additional factors that you might want to consider when you're talking about what beyond the minimum level of requirement that you might want to provide for your workers. Again, the previous injuries, we've seen lacerations and burns in the kitchens, the MSI injuries from in our housekeeping department. We've got some psychological injuries dealing with difficult guests, whether that's just mitigated with a conversation after, whether they have to go for further assistance, and then that's a claim then. So just listing some of those things that you've seen happen previously that you might want to consider when you're talking about giving first aid above the minimum requirement. Okay, we got barriers to first aid, the communication channels. So not everybody carries a radio. It's a large hotel property. So how far away is the first aid attendant working from where somebody might get hurt? You know, if it's greater than 10 minutes, that's a consideration. Rescue equipment for less accessible areas. So for Lonnie's Hotel, we don't have any, but it could be roof accessibility, confined space program equipment, that type of thing. And then known barriers for BC ambulance. Again, for Lonnie's Hotel, we don't really have anything. It's pretty close to everything, but it could be that road accessibility, the multiple options for ambulance stations that I was kind of talking about before, those closed ER areas that you kind of see on the news sometimes, those known barriers. So you want to factor all of that in to determine what above the minimum that you want to provide for your staff. So if you're super happy with just the minimum first aid requirements, then you can click this box and you're basically done your assessment. If you'd like to provide some more support to your team based on these additional factors, then you can list it here. So the first aid kits, we technically only need one basic first aid kit, but because we have multiple locations, we're going to have maybe 3 basic first aid kits throughout the location. And then I would add the location of those first aid kits. Maybe it's closer to where the first aid attendants are going to be working so that they can grab it and go really quickly. Supplemental first aid equipment. So if looking at those first aid kits, the supplies that are listed in those, burn cream, I'd be surprised if burn cream is in there, but because we have burns happening in our restaurant, we're going to have some burn cream on site. You know, those types of things. Okay, maybe some more additional ice packs for any sore muscles and stuff like that. So you can list the supplemental supplies that you have, or say you need some of that rescue equipment for less accessible areas. That's where you would list it as well. First aid facilities, we have maybe a dressing station in the staff area. Okay, so that's where all of the additional supplies are going to live. And then for first aid attendants, we have worker 1 who has first aid, and worker 2. And then I would add their location as well of where they usually do work, and how to get in touch with them, I think, is a good one too, and their certification level. Okay, and then you can give the total workplace. So maybe these workers, we only have one first aid attendant on at a time. So then you can say, you know, worker 1 works X amount of days, Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday. Worker 2 works Wednesday, Thursday, Friday, Saturday. Those types of things can be listed in there. And then same with this one, emergency transportation. I'm comfortable with not providing any additional emergency transportation for our staff. Okay, so that gives your bigger picture of beyond the minimum level of requirement that we want to be able to provide for the staff. Then what I'm going to do is save it, put it in my health and safety manual, and obviously go over it with workers if they weren't involved in filling it out specifically. So yeah, so that is my example of the first aid assessment being filled out for Lonnie's Hotel. So before we get to the Q&A period, what we're going to do is just cover some of the resources and support that we have available for you. So obviously the implementation deadline is that November 1st. We have a bunch of online resources. If you scan that QR code, it's going to take you to the first aid changes explained page. There's links there to all the WorkSafe resources that are available. There's a brief description of the changes. WorkSafe came out with a 3-minute video on the changes as well, which is linked on there. So take a look at that. We have obviously our upcoming webinars that you're all aware of, the 19th and the 23rd, procedural updates and best practices, and then drills. We're going to talk all about drills on the 23rd. So please come to those as well. We also have some unique support available for you. So we've been doing first aid consultations for the last couple of months. So we would walk through that assessment process with you, with your business in mind, and give you an implementation action plan as well for that. You can also email us your questions by either emailing safety@gotohr.ca or using that contact us form online, which is what that QR code will take you to. So that QR code is this QR code, but we're going to move into our Q&A period. So I'm going to hand it over to Simi, who's going to give us the first question. Maybe start with an easy one, will you?
Sure. So yeah, we had some questions come in here. So one of the most upvoted ones is, with properties with multi-building units, do we assess the company as an entity as a whole, or do we need to do separate assessments per?
Tim, do you want to give that one a go?
Sure. Yeah, I was just going to ask, do you want me to jump in here?
Sure.
Yeah, so in our guideline, we actually list criteria for determining if you have separate workplaces. So there's a number of factors that you would look at. You would look at things like, is the workplace under the control of a single employer? Is there a prime contractor? Those would be factors supporting it's a single workplace. If we're looking at separate workplace, there might be things like the locations are controlled by different employers. There might be physical barriers that would prevent first aid attendants from going from one area to another area. So what I would just encourage, I would encourage everybody to, if you have a multi-area workplace, look at the guideline to see how it fits your situation.
Okay, perfect. Thank you, Tim. So the next question we have here is for seasonal businesses, how do we identify the number of employees as it constantly fluctuates throughout the year with a sizable discrepancy?
I can take that one, Tim, and maybe you can add
Okay,
if I
sure.
miss
Yeah.
something. So for the seasonal businesses, one of the considerations, I guess, in general, is to do that annual first aid assessment or whenever significant operational change occurs. So for us seasonal businesses, that would be considered an operational change, a significant operational change. And so I would then encourage you to do a new first aid assessment for that off season versus on season.
Yeah, that's right, Lonnie. That's right. And so if you look at the guideline too, it states the typical maximum number of workers on that shift or perhaps that season of operation. So it's going to vary depending on the workplace. So you're going to have to look at all of uh, the entire situation. It's hard to really give a broad stroke to this question, but you can do multiple assessments, and you want to look at what's the typical maximum number of workers on that shift or in that season.
Mm-hmm. And that I see another question here that's kind of in the same vein about overnight employees. So yeah, you'll want to do different assessments for the different shift times. If there's a significant discrepancy where the result would be the minimum requirement would be different day versus evening or overnight.
Perfect. Another question that we had is, do the new WSBC compliances trump or overlap other compliances, for example, Transport Canada?
Okay, interesting question. So what I'll suggest with that question, if the individual could maybe contact me directly or go to HR and just provide more specific information on what types of compliance you're speaking to.
Yeah, because I think the one thing to keep in mind is provincial versus federally regulated workplaces. And so that would be part of the question, I think, that we can take offline. Next question, Simi.
Okay, so are workplaces allowed to conduct their own supplementary first aid training that used to be included in OFA 2, but are no longer covered in IFA?
Okay, so yes, employers do have the right to provide their workers additional WorkSafe mandated, as long as you're using qualified instructors and you're not putting your workers at risk. I don't see a concern with that.
Okay. What if your workplace falls under multiple CUs?
Yeah, so that's a similar situation to having multiple buildings or multiple work areas. In some cases, that could mean separate assessments. So if there is a significant distance between those operations, they might require a separate assessment because first aid attendants might be unable to move between the two work areas. And as well, some businesses might have higher risk activities. So let's say for the example of a ski hill, they might have construction activities happening in the summer, and that could be a high risk activity. And so you would want to do a separate assessment for that aspect of your operations, and you would want to restrict other workers from going into those areas given the high risk.
Awesome. Thanks, Tim. Another question we had here is with the assessment and seasonal changes, which is based on a number of workers, is it acceptable to keep the highest level of assessment throughout the season to provide consistency for our staff?
Yeah, of course, because you would be providing the highest possible first aid care. That wouldn't be a concern. The only time there's concern is if the level of first aid care is being reduced. And so in those situations, that would, we would take a closer look at those types of situations.
Great. Who is responsible for filling out the assessment? And the deadline is November 1st, but we don't have to submit the assessment anywhere. Just keep it on file.
Yeah, these are excellent questions. Correct. It just needs to be kept on file to show that you've done it. And so we will have officers doing regular inspections as they always do. And, if they're looking at your first aid program, that is one thing they will likely want to see.
And for the part of that question for who is responsible for filling out the assessment, the employer is ultimately responsible to have the first aid program in place, but that person may delegate to a manager or to the Joint Health and Safety Committee in order to make that happen. So it could differentiate between businesses of who is going to be responsible for filling out that assessment sheet.
Perfect. And then there was sort of a similar question here where they're asking, can all types of employees under BC ESA, for example, casual, part-time, on-call, can they complete the assessment? And there's a follow-up question as well regarding hybrid and remote workers. So should they be accounted in the number of total employees?
Okay, so I don't know if I quite understand the question on casual and part-time workers. What I'm thinking is maybe it's being asked whether they should be included in the counting of the workers, and the answer to that would be yes.
When they're on site.
When they're on site.
Yeah.
That's right. Thank
Yeah.
you. For dispatched workers, we do have a formula in the guideline which explains how those workers should be counted, and it's based on the amount of time that they spend on the work site. And for workers who are dispatched, whether they're delivery drivers or trades repair workers, they would require a separate assessment when they're working independently.
Perfect. Do we know why St. John's Ambulance is approved and not Canadian Red Cross for intermediate first aid courses? All of our local first aid businesses are Red Cross trainers, making it tough to access this new course.
Okay, so I might not be the speak on that because that's handled in our certification services department. But what I would guess is that they are going through the submitted courses from all of the first aid providers right now, and it could be that they just haven't completed the process of approving St. John Ambulance. St. John Ambulance is approved, I see in the question here. And I would guess that Canadian Red Cross would be approved fairly quickly. But yeah, I acknowledge it's a busy time, and it's tough to get your workers certified when we're going through these changes. Hopefully, the fact that certifications will remain valid until they naturally expire for the pre-existing OFA courses, hopefully that will alleviate some of the load.
Perfect. Would you require a drill with doing a different first aid?
Would you?
Might need a bit more clarification for that one.
Yeah,
okay.
Maybe go to a different question and maybe they can provide
maybe what I'll just add to that is the drills are mainly to evaluate your first aid procedures. So the type of injury isn't necessarily critical, although you do want to be able to assess your treatment of minor and major injuries. Perhaps that answers the question.
Okay. We have here, are there any transportation requirements if that is required for your workplace, for example, vehicle type and supplies in the vehicle?
I'll keep going then, unless you want to interrupt me, Lonnie. So for emergency transport vehicles, there is guidance in the guideline. So if because of your workplace size and hazard and location, if you're required to have an ETV, we do list the equipment that you should have in those vehicles. And what I'll just add here too is that for minor injuries, there are other ways to transport workers to medical treatment. And so this can happen in company vehicles and other work vehicles that are insured. It doesn't always have to be an emergency transport vehicle unless it's a significant injury that requires it.
Yeah, I think one of the things to add to that is if you're using a company vehicle, just ensure that the driver has their license and the vehicle's insured properly, and the procedure for transporting somebody in a work vehicle is all set up and ready to go as well. And the driver and first aid attendant who might be going with them are all trained on that transportation procedure.
Okay.
Yes, and there is some language in the guideline too about company vehicles having regular inspections. So that's another thing to note.
Okay. We have 135 workers. How many workers should we speak with when doing this assessment? Our JHSC co-chairs will be undertaking the assessment.
What I would do is just table it at the committee meeting. And then I think that would appease the requirement, right, Tim?
Sounds good to me.
Yeah.
Okay, I guess that kind of answers the second question there. Is there a minimum number of attendees for filling out the assessment if we have an OHS rep?
So not specifically. Yeah, as with Lonnie just said there, do it at your committee meeting. If you're too small to have a committee, then have your designated worker rep. For workplaces that are larger than 9, under 20, they require a worker rep. And for your really small workplaces of 9 or less, this is something you can cover at your monthly safety meeting.
Perfect. Are staff on site who are not working, like a camp at night, part of your overall count of workers?
Great question.
Yeah, it makes sense. If you have a workplace, it makes sense to include staff who are there, just like as you would include staff who are on a lunch break or a coffee break, you would still include those in your assessment. So I think that would make sense in this case. If you're looking for more detail on this question, please feel free to get in touch with me.
Yeah, I'm curious because depending on what the work site is, their hazard rating would be lower. So maybe it would be a separate assessment, or that would be in consideration when you're doing the assessment for those workers, potentially.
Possibly.
Yeah. So it seems like a complex question. So yeah, get in touch with us after the fact.
Okay, and then are there any free sites for managing first aid attendant schedules so each day people know who is on site on any given day or time?
I don't think we can back one specific site or anything like that, but I think there's a few, at least from what I know, there's a few different scheduling apps that you can get that have features like that in there, where you could give first aid attendant a special color or whatever, so that you know who's on site at what time, and the staff would have that app on their phone to see who's there. You can also do it manually as well if you have a safety notice board or a whiteboard where you put specific people up. You could have a section on that board saying who the first aid attendant is and where they're working and how to get in touch with them.
Perfect. And can you provide places to get first aid training for restaurants? It has been difficult to find out what time.
Yeah, so okay, so sometimes there will be first aid training that would come onto site or do a specialized session for your staff potentially. So then you could pick the date and the time, which might work better for your restaurant hours to be outside of your typical restaurant operating hours. So what I would do is find out what first aid training providers are in your community and contact them to see if they'd be willing to put on a special training program or offer additional time that would work for your staff.
Perfect. And that's all of our questions.
Great. Okay, great. So thank you so much for coming to our webinar. And oh, we got one more here. Maybe when WorkSafe arrives to review our assessment, will they require proof of drills? I'm curious because we may do the assessment but not able to do a drill right away. Also, is there a template for emergency drills? Tim, I know you know this answer one.
Thanks for that last minute question. It's a good one as well. Documentation that you've done your drills, because that will provide evidence that you've done it. There's potentially a template that's going to be coming out, but if you look at the guideline and it talks about the criteria that you're looking at for your drills, as long as you have a way of assessing those items and checking off that you've done that in your drill, that's something. And in terms of doing the drills, I believe the language in the guideline says that they should be done as soon as practicable. And so that suggests that there's going to be some discretion in terms of the timing of the drills. Obviously, this is not something, and some work operations, we can't drop everything on November 1st. So please do them as soon as it's practical.
Okay, perfect, Tim. So yeah, I think I got a message from Judy here. She said, last question, please, for overtime.
That's okay. So thanks again for spending time with us here today. And we will give out the slides and the recording and everything, hopefully by the end of the week, maybe. And then, yeah, please, if you need to get in touch with us to do some assessments of your own business, then we can do that with you on a one-on-one basis. And we'll hopefully see you next week for the best practices and procedural updates that you need to include. So thanks again. Have a great day, everyone, and we'll see you next week.
Thank you.
Thank you.